This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. Robert Sikoryak has built a reputation for doing big, painstakingly created art books that combine the styles of a wide variety of specific comics with an unrelated topic, including his 2009 release, Masterpiece Comics, which, for example, tells Kafka's Metamorphosis in the style of Charles Schulz's Peanuts, and Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, mashed up with Marge's Little Lulu. More recently, he came out with The Unquotable Trump, pairing actual Donald Trump quotes and the image of Trump with specific actual comics covers, such as R. Crumb's Mr. Natural, Marvel's original Secret Wars series, and the Transformers. His latest is called Terms and Conditions, in which those classic comic styles are paired with the actual text of the iTunes Terms and Conditions that most of us have agreed to, but few of us have actually read. This week, an in-depth interview with Sikoryak, conducted by Koom at the Toronto Comic Arts Festival last month, in which he discusses his interest in doing parody and the kind of parody he does, how he chooses the ideas to pair together in his work, getting in the head of the creator whose work he's parodying, and much more. First, just a reminder that you can help this podcast by making your Amazon purchases via deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon, and make that your bookmark for future purchases. We'll then get a percentage of what you spend. It costs you nothing extra and helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of presenting the show every week. We really appreciate your support.
This is Koom at TCAF for Deconstructing Comics, and I'm here with... Do you go by Robert or Rob?
People call me Bob. I always sign my work R.
Okay.
But you can call me Bob. You can call me Robert.
Okay. And is Sikoryak the correct pronunciation? All right. Pleasure to meet you. So you're here at TCAF. If I can ask a question, because I've seen you every year at TCAF doing your carousel. Do you sell so many books that it's worth the flight up here, or?
Well, Kryota and I travel together, and we both like Toronto, so it's an easy trip for us to make. And the last couple of years, Kryota has been giving talks about injury prevention for cartoonists in the panels that they do on the Friday before the shows. So between just liking to visit and Kryota doing her lectures, it's been going pretty well. Sometimes we do very well with selling books, but yeah, it fluctuates.
And at this point, are you sort of here on D&Q's behest, or are you still here pretty much as an independent entity?
No, for this time I'm here for the new book.
Yeah.
For Terms and Conditions.
Okay.
So, but yeah, Kryota's been doing a lot of stuff here, so it's just been good because we both like a reason to get out of New York once in a while.
Okay, cool. I have been reading a few of your previous interviews, so I'm going to try not to replicate questions as much as I can, but just feel free to let me know if there's anything you want to talk about, and I'll try to hit on a few different things. I just wanted to go back to, I know you worked on Raw right out of college, but did you come to New York for college, or are you a New Yorker by birth?
I was born in New Jersey. I came to New York to go to school at Parsons. And because I assumed I would be involved in publishing in some form, I always wanted to do comics. And I was lucky enough to get introduced to Art Spiegelman and Francoise Mouly at Raw. And I started doing work with them around the office and eventually got more and more involved with the publishing of their books.
Cool. And I know that you read comics with your brothers growing up. So did you kind of see yourself saying that you wanted to be in comics? Did you have an inkling that you'd be doing these parody type or postmodern type works? Or did you see yourself like working for Marvel or DC or something like Dell or Gold Key or something like that.
Well, I wasn't. It's funny. The world of comics has changed so much. I graduated from school in 1987. And
when you say school, do you mean Parsons?
From college.
Yeah.
I graduated from art school, college in 1987, and the world of comics was so different then. The mainstream was mostly Marvel and DC. I didn't see myself doing that work. I grew up reading a lot of that work. I grew up reading a lot of those kinds of comics, but I didn't see myself doing that work myself. I wasn't really interested, and I can't imagine being able to work at that pace. So I sort of assumed that I would be doing illustration work and freelance art projects and doing comics on the side, which is pretty much what happened. And then as the comics world kind of grew between 1987 and today, 30 years of evolution has just brought so many changes that it's given me more opportunities to make comics for different people and different audiences than I expected originally.
Right. Are you still doing a lot of work for hire illustration jobs?
Yeah, it goes back and forth. The last 7 years, I've been working with an animation studio in Brooklyn called Augenblick, working on their projects. I really like animation. That was something else I thought I might go into back in the 80s, but I actually auditioned once to be a cell painter, if you remember what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a couple of cells.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
So cell painting was like the traditional 2D animation technique where the drawings would be done on clear acetate, and then they would be colored, they'd be painted, and then those clear pieces would be placed on a background. So you could see through the background, but the painted figure would pop. So I actually auditioned at a studio in 1988, and I had never painted cells, although I had done like black and white animation in school. So I painted a cell, and I did a terrible job, and I thought, well, I'm never working in animation. And then 20 some years later, computer animation was available as an option, and I work in Flash with Augenblick in Brooklyn. They work totally digitally, but it's all drawn on Cintiqs, which are the computer screens that essentially that capture mark
Sure.
making. So it's a good way of impersonating the look of classic 2D animation, but it's all done digitally. So luckily I didn't have to paint cells for 20 years to get there.
Cool. Now, I remember asking you once on Facebook, and you kind of joked in response, but I said, you'd put up a New Yorker cover or something that was like old that you did, and I said, did you ever have like a quote-unquote authentic style, or did you just always just parody stuff? And then you joked back that you always parodied stuff that you never did. But you must have had something that was like more of a quote-unquote organic style before you got into the path you're doing now.
Well, when I was in art school, there was always talk from some teachers about the importance of having a style, having a particular way of working. And I always liked to play around with different media and different techniques. I think my cartooning style was really derivative when I was in school. I was really influenced by people who were popular in the 80s. There was sort of a wave of cartooning called New Wave cartooning, which was kind of like ratty drawing, scribbly line work. Gary Panther is maybe
Sure.
the most famous of that school, although I feel like he is a school unto himself.
Right.
Anyway, I felt like I was very influenced by what was happening in comics around me, the comics I was reading. And I was concerned that my work would just be derivative if I kind of adopted a style that other people were using at the time. So even when I was in college, I went to Parsons. I also sat in on some classes at SVA because I knew Art Spiegelman and other people who taught
Sure.
at SVA. So in working with them and thinking about the way I would make work. Even in school, I was playing with parody a lot. So there's not much of my work that's been commercially released that isn't trying to evoke one style or another. But I never put a flag in the ground and said, this is my style. I was always interested in trying different stuff out. So
Sure.
I wasn't joking when I said I never really developed a style.
Yeah.
I think if you see my sketches and if you see some of my mini comics, which I often make between like publishing my final books, you can see more. You can see more of a sense of my line quality and like my instincts.
Yeah.
But I'm really interested in kind of figuring out how other people make comics. So by the time my books get published, I try to sort of like tamp down any of my impulses and really kind of like embrace styles that I find elsewhere.
Sure. I think just a lot of people kind of respond to your work and try to find like the missing link. Like, where did he go from? We're assuming that everybody has, like everybody's kind of derivative, but there's something kind of unconscious where, like, I don't know, for a lot of people it was Kirby, right? There's like a Kirby influence. Like, you can even look at like early Barry Windsor Smith stuff and see like a Kirby thing kind of coming out. And so I guess if not Parsons, then like going back to high school, like you must have been sketching. Were you, I don't know, like unconsciously kind of working in a particular mode? And then I guess Parsons was the time when you met Spiegelman and all of that, when you started kind of going, well, I can parody stuff and figure out people's styles. But was there something beforehand that was,
Well, I mean, I could say seminal influences being like Peanuts, Charles Schulz. I think Schulz. When I was a kid, my brothers and I would make comics.
Right.
And I used to do 4-panel comics.
Right.
And I haven't looked at them in years, but I'm sure I like picked up, like in terms of the pacing of the stories, I'm sure I picked up a ton of stuff from Schulz. Like they were comedy strips.
Sure.
And I'm sure I sort of picked up lots of like stylistic tics, or like I say, like writing tics from him. I was also reading a lot of Marvel comics. My brothers and I would actually do parodies of Marvel comics.
So you're doing parodies?
Yeah, I was doing. Yeah, and it's sort of wild to think about that. But I was also reading Mad Magazine, and
sure.
I don't think I knew who Kurtzman was by name because I was only reading his stuff in reprints. Like there were these black and white paperbacks that would reprint his early work. But from Mad. But I remember like looking at those like Will Elder drawings that were like so detailed and grotesque and really being kind of fascinated by them. And Will Elder in a way is an influence when I think of it now because he would always shift styles. I mean, he did Little Annie Fanny for years, but he did Goodman Beaver, which is kind of a different, like almost like a woodcut kind of style. And then all the stuff he did for Mad was would look like Norman Rockwell or would look like, trying to think of who else he did. He would do like H.G. Peter from Wonder Woman or something like that. So he would jump around stylistically a lot. So I wasn't consciously thinking of being him, but I feel like even the parody stuff my brothers and I were doing would owed so much to Mad, just that kind of like storytelling. So I mean, if you looked at my stuff in art school, in high school when I was doing like art stuff, you'd probably see the influence of comics all over. But and those influences, I was reading Marvel for a long time, so beyond Jack Kirby, like all the stuff. My brothers and I collected almost everything that Marvel put out. And then I was reading all the newspaper comics of the day, so that would be, everything from like Rex Morgan to Ziggy.
Gotcha. Yeah, obviously there's a huge love of the entire, field work of comics that's in your work. So maybe then, what's the common element? Because there is something when one reads your stuff that goes, yeah, like that's Sikoryak, or I want Sikoryak, and then I'm satisfied with his latest, parody or whatever. So maybe the thing is, it's a sensibility, and I can see how Mad is a big factor in that. But your stuff isn't really like, it's not brash like Mad. There's a kind of sophisticated, it's not a cool detachment, it's an ironic kind of winking, kind of, dancing between the style and the substance kind of thing. And it's very New Yorker-y, I think. Like, it's sort of like when I read New Yorker cartoons, and you have to have a little bit of intelligence and be in the know to kind of get this spoof, but at the same time it's lighthearted enough that it's not necessarily an intellectual statement on its own. It's a kind of, it's like would you say that's your thing? Like, what's the pleasure you get out of that?
Well, you mentioned earlier that you'd seen a John Cage comic that I did.
Yes.
Where I adapted John Cage stories and anecdotes that Cage told about his own life. I adapted those into different comic styles. And that was the first strip where I really sort of put together a lot of the pieces that were interesting to me. Mm-hmm. Because I was taking pre-existing stories and adapting them into the style of well-known comics. So for that strip, I did like Prince Valiant and Crazy Cat and Barnaby and Mary Worth and a few other ones. So I think my interest in John Cage even, it says a lot about the way that I put my comics together, because John Cage as a composer would often leave a lot of his decision making to chance operations, as he called it. And I think you can maybe see that more vividly in my Terms and Conditions book, but I think even my earlier work, like Masterpiece Comics, I tried not to editorialize. And I think that's the difference between what I do and what Mad does. And I actually like that Mad is so upfront about it. You know, they'll say in the middle of a story, well, isn't this dumb? Yeah. Why are you reading this? Like they'll comment about the stuff. And that's something that I never wanted to do in mine, because I felt like we kind of had to move the goalposts a little farther, I guess. Yeah. Mad is still going, and I do work.
But Mad's not now what it used to be.
No, but it's for a different generation. Yeah. But I work for them sometimes. I've done illustration work for them. I've drawn comics for them, and I like that they're around. And that's a good introduction maybe for kids. I think kids still like it. I don't have kids. I don't know, but I could see that it would still have appeal. That sort of brashness. So I guess what I'm doing is a step forward, not necessarily an evolution, but just it's a step away from that into something else. And that's more a matter of kind of really being faithful to the sources that I'm choosing, even if those sources don't belong together. So if I'm doing like Crime and Punishment in the style of a 1950s Batman comic, those Dostoevsky and Bob Kane don't really belong together, but I pretend that they do for the length of the story, and I don't call attention to it. I just put them together and see what happens.
Right.
So I think that's sort of, there's a certain detachment from what I did. But I think that's where the humor comes from, and certainly the choices of what I put together definitely reveal my sensibility.
Yes.
And my interests.
It's a kind of like when I've been telling people about your Trump stuff, like the common reaction is, oh, that's brilliant. Or if they don't say those words, the reaction kind of embodies that, right? But like, say, like the Dostoevsky, the Batman, Raskolnikov thing, is kind of fascinating. But like, let's say with Trump, how do you avoid editorializing? Because most of the people who are going to respond to that are going to be anti-Trump, or at least are going to think Trump's kind of ridiculous.
Well, I think the Trump book is very different, and I didn't want to do it.
You didn't want to do it?
I had the idea before the election. Mm-hmm. I thought, this would be funny. Because
it's very much of the election, and yet
it's of the election. It's of the campaign, actually. I thought of it before the election happened. 4 days before the election happened, I thought, that would be really funny to take old comic book covers and insert Trump. Mm. But I was like, I don't want to think about him anymore.
Because it's oversaturated?
I was hoping that he'd be gone. I was hoping he would be run out of the kingdom.
Most of us.
I only had 4 days before the election. I thought, well, I'm not going to make something that is irrelevant, because, it looked more likely that he was going to win the last week, but I didn't want to face that reality.
No. Sure.
So actually on Twitter, I said, hey, someone should take old comic book covers and use quotes from Trump and do it for me, because I don't want to do it.
Had you done any by that point?
No, I didn't. And then after he won, I was like, I should really revisit that. This Trump book is totally editorializing. It's I've been telling people that it's not as pure as my other work, but we live in an impure world.
Sure.
And I felt like this was the time to be impure, because I was very upset. Now it's very much editorializing. I don't really see that fans of his would enjoy it.
No, and are you worried at all? Because, I mean, both his fans and Trump himself, they're quite aggressive in their reactions to people who criticize.
I just heard this great quote from Jon Stewart. He was on Colbert last week, and he said something like, I don't understand why... he said it better than me, but he said something like, I don't understand why comedians get so much flack for like stating an opinion. It's like, it's one thing to insult people, it's another thing to injure people. At most a comedian can insult, but people like Trump and people in power have the ability to injure people.
Right.
So it's like it's not a level playing field, and it's fair game for comedians to speak out and to say things like that. If supporters of Trump want to buy my book to burn it, I'm fine with that.
Right. So it doesn't really sound like you have any misgivings about producing it. You have misgivings about the fact that you exist in a time where you're impelled to kind of deviate course a little from your aesthetics to take more of a personal stand.
I'm uneasy that he's president. I think he's a disaster, and I can't take pleasure in the book because the book only exists because of this disaster. So it's and I just find it I find it really I'm just so conflicted about that we live in this timeline, that this alternate timeline has come true.
And yet, like, it's as aesthetically satisfying, if not more so than your other stuff, because it's so topical. When I was in touch with D&Q, I said, this is the book I really want to review. And they said, well, it's not out yet. It's the iTunes that we're pushing out. And I said, okay, that's fine. But, like, for comic book fans who like your work, it's just like an added bonus. It's an added layer, but you're still getting that faithful, nostalgic zaniness, of you kind of harkening to that stuff. So to me, I don't see. Oh, this is one of my favorites. It's a Black Panther, but it's the Black Voter. I was showing one of my friends yesterday. It's just that brilliance of your pairing is just really there. I have a couple of questions from people in the group. So. Kumar Sivasubramanian, who's a young lad in Australia down under, asks, how do you know when you've found the right combo? Peanuts Metamorphosis makes total sense, but you wouldn't guess right away with something like Little Lulu, Scarlet Letter. And I know you talked about this a bit before. Sometimes it's just left field improvisation, but how do you know when you found that brilliant vein?
I guess when it just strikes me that there's something there, it's the most intuitive part of the process for me. Once I sort of decide to move forward on it, then I'm kind of committed. I've never backed out of a project that I've started. But the Little Lulu Scarlet Letter one is interesting because I clearly remember like halfway through it, and it was a long story. It was a 12-page story, and it's a very dense book, and I was juggling a lot of elements, and I was in the middle of, like, probably a few months into it, I was like, I don't think this is going to work. Like, I just remember waking up in the middle of the night going, like, why did I choose this?
But it's one of the most beautiful, memorable ones in the book.
Thanks. So there's self-doubt that happens in the midst of it. And that one was very clearly, I felt like that was maybe pushing it. But I did feel like with that one, an idea will pop in my head, and I have a notebook. I have many pieces of paper and notebooks that have like ideas for things that I may or may not get to. So I think about them for a while. I just mull them over in my head, and if enough points seem to connect, then I'm then I get excited about doing it and I jump in. There's a number of books I would really love to do, and there's a number of comics I really want to parody. And in the case of Little Lulu and the Scarlet Letter, I think in that case I was really ready to do a Lulu parody. The Scarlet Letter is an important book in the United States. I don't know if more so, maybe not around the world, but certainly in the U.S.
Oh, well, it's got a big presence
iconic
here. I don't know that it's really studied in high school as it probably still is in the States.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the other thing, too, is I just wonder if Hawthorne has a reputation, because he didn't have that much competition at that period in American history.
Well, he did have Melville.
And Poe, to some degree, right?
What's that?
Doesn't Poe come in pretty soon after? Yeah. But
I like morality tales.
Yeah.
Which is probably why I'm also doing the Trump thing.
Right.
Because I'm attracted to stories about good and evil, and usually it's more metaphorical than what we're living through right now. But I mean, there's certain, like I say, there's novels I really want to deal with. That seemed like a rich novel to play with. But yeah, the Peanuts Metamorphosis story worked out better than I even imagined. As I was drawing it, I remember thinking like, wow, these really are the same sensibility. There's Kafka's got comedy and Schulz has existential dread. And it's like, we don't necessarily think of those qualities first. Yeah. But they're very much there. It shouldn't be a surprise that they would share those sensibilities across each other. But I mean, across their two
I think the Peanuts one is kind of like the Action Camus one, where you have the Siegel and Schuster Superman standing in for Camus' Stranger, right? And what's nice about those is they're bite-sized, and as soon as you get the connection, you go, oh, I get it. It's like that New Yorker kind of thing. You go, I understand that topsy-turvy but brilliant, erudite connection. Whereas the thing about The Little Pearl is that you don't get that connection immediately, but you go like, this is so bizarre and yet so mesmerizing, so it keeps you reading. Whereas with the Peanuts, after you get that connection, it depends on your wit and your ability to, draw that, to do that writing thing that you do really well. It's like a really good joke that's like being played out. Whereas with the Pearl, it's so... And I think the Crypt Keeper one is like that too, with Wuthering Heights, to some degree. Like, you see why you do it, because it's a
Gothic romance.
Thank you. It's a Gothic romance. But at the same time, there's something about the texture of it that keeps you kind of going through it. Ian McMurray, a young man from Japan, asks, do you draw boundaries between high and low art? He is a comics artist himself. And he says he fell in love with the first strip he ever saw of yours, which is Garish Feline, which is the de Kooning Garfield. And so he's asking specifically about art as in visual art. Do you kind of still look at that dichotomy, or have you kind of moved beyond that?
Again, I think the world has changed so much since I went to school. So in the 80s, there was lots of talk in museums and in magazines about high culture versus low culture. I'm sure it was going on long before then, but I was just very aware of it when I was in school and when I started working at Raw. So I don't think the high art, low art thing means at all what it used to. Yeah. It's funny to me, a lot of people do mashups where they'll combine like one pop culture reference with another pop culture reference, and I don't quite understand those. I don't feel like there's the friction, but I don't think the friction really exists between high art and low art like it did when I started making these. So it's a very different world. I'm not sure if this is answering his question, but I don't think those distinctions are relevant the way they used to be. Yeah. But I was certainly very aware of it, and I grew up in a world where comics weren't really read by adults, and where it was a little embarrassing to be seen reading a comic. So things have changed a lot.
Sure.
Coming up, why do a book on the iTunes terms and conditions? Does explaining the absurdity in his comics take away from that absurdity? Getting in the head of the writer or artist you're parodying, and Sikoryak's day job of teaching comics to young artists. As you know, we recently hit a Patreon goal, and therefore I'm gradually adding to our website, in reverse order, episodes 116 to 130, which had been missing ever since the current site was set up in 2008. In the left sidebar of our site, scroll down to Archives and click May 2008 to see the most recently added episodes. I'm also gradually adding to the number of episodes available in the feed, and eventually all the episodes will be available there. And now we're only $8 away from our next goal, which would obligate me to make episodes 101 to 115 available again. So make me work harder by making a pledge at patreon.com/deconcomics. We'd really appreciate your support.
I'm Batman.
And I'm Robin.
This is Tim.
And this is Paul.
To the Bat Polls!
The iTunes reviews are in on To the Bat Polls podcast. A terrific podcast, Rave's Got a Rugrat, that brings review, film analysis, and sociological impact to episode-by-episode musings without ever losing the feeling of two brothers with towels tied around their necks, running through the backyard. Unmissable.
Exquisite.
You've heard the reviews, now try it for yourself. New episodes on the first, third, and fifth Thursdays of the month on iTunes or Stitcher, or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com.
Wild!
For nostalgia, analysis, and fun, it's
To the Bat Polls.
Well, we should talk about the iTunes book. I mean, you've gotten so much press for it, and I think that's fantastic, because you should stand head and shoulders above all of the other parody mishmash stuff that's going on. But one big question is, why? Why do it? Because unlike the Trump stuff, you're not really editorializing. I mean, part of the joke is that the terms and conditions are so long, and why read them? Well, let's, conjoin them with unintuitive comic styles, and then, but why do it? I mean, are you making a statement against Apple? Are you making a statement against the readability of these user agreements? Beyond the pleasure of parodying the comic styles, I mean, you could almost pick anything else, right? You could pick like an entertainment contract. You could pick, you could pick a segment of legislation. That is why.
Well, this one was very intuitive, and the whole thing sort of maybe came from kind of a midlife crisis in a way.
Yeah, I do remember you saying that you wanted to do a longer book.
Yeah.
And then this became that project.
Yeah. Well, it really freed me up from a lot of decisions that I felt sort of trapped by.
Yeah.
And you actually, the way you ask the question is good, because I feel like it's something that I don't always mention in interviews, and people maybe are coming at it from a slightly different angle. So I think this is fair to say. The work that I normally do, the adaptations of literature, tend to take really long texts and boil them down. And I felt like, because I grew up with newspaper comics, and I grew up with classic like Marvel superhero comics, I was kind of more familiar with and more interested in the compression of comics, where you could have like a really satisfying 4-panel strip from Peanuts, or even if you're going to think big, a 20-page comic book story, that was complete. So have always been interested in kind of following that movement of comics, which is to compress, versus the manga style and even the contemporary graphic novel style, which is to expand and to decompress. I forget what the right term I'm looking for is, but essentially like expanding. Dilate. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I sense that at my current rate of production, I might get a sequel to Masterpiece Comics out in a few years.
Sure.
And that would be another 64-page comic, while I felt like the world of comics had moved somewhere else,
Right.
and it moved toward volume.
Right.
So I was really interested in making a long form work
Right.
that would be one story, quote unquote story. But because of my interest in subverting my very idea, I wanted to choose an unlikely source material. I could have chosen another contract. I could have chosen another nonfiction text, but I knew I wanted to do something in its entirety, and there are so many adaptations of prose into comics that I also kind of wanted to respond to that. A lot of my work with adapting is kind of making fun of the conceit of adaptation.
Yeah.
Because any adaptation you make or any translation you make is not going to be the original. People really want faithfulness. People really want to see their version of a story, remade into a film or remade
Right.
into a comic book.
Right.
And this is folly. It can't be done.
Right.
So my technique has always been to put things that don't belong together, and then see what happens and let that be its own thing.
Right.
So make some kind of mutant form. So for the iTunes book, when I was thinking about what text to use, it just popped in my head. A long text that nobody reads got me to the iTunes terms and conditions.
Yes.
And I was very excited about that, partially because there's no narrative, there's no characters, there's nothing cinematic about it. It doesn't lend itself to illustration.
Right.
And I really liked the idea of disassociating the visuals from the text. And I really just wanted to make a long form comic. And because I embrace the absurdity of
Sure.
all my comics projects,
Sure.
this seemed like the thing to do.
It's bold for sure.
It's bold, and I made it as a mini comic, and I put it up on Tumblr. I didn't know if it would ever become a book.
Yeah.
I did not expect the attention I got. I put it on Tumblr. I put it out as a mini. They put it out on Tumblr. A month after it was on Tumblr, I sent out an email to just my friends and contacts in the press and at magazines, and just said, I made this thing. Here it is. And within 24 hours,
The Guardian.
The Guardian, Boing Boing, NPR had me on Morning Edition, interviewed me on Morning Edition. I got all this attention I was not expecting.
But that's fantastic.
And I think it's the absurdity of it. I guess if I had made an earnest rendering of the entire iTunes agreement, it would have gotten the same amount of attention, perhaps. But I think that I would have gone crazy if I tried to literally illustrate it. And
Right.
I was
Right.
I was interested in making something against the way, a more pedestrian approach.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing, though, the element that sort of works is that you've got Steve Jobs and I know you'll say this wasn't your intention, but kind of like Trump in the new Trump stuff, it sort of lampoons him. And there's a joy, at least for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people, seeing him lampooned, because he wasn't the nicest character, and he was a very egotistical character. Mm-hmm. So it sort of takes the piss out of him to make him this, and was that part of the intent, or maybe the megalith of Apple and its dominance over, its corporate dominance?
Yeah, I don't know what I would have done if I decided on the Amazon terms of service or whatever they're called.
Sure.
I could have done that. I'm actually not a big fan of Amazon, but I am a big fan of Apple products. I think, but the thing is, if I had chosen Amazon, I don't know if I could have dressed people as Jeff Bezos and they would have even understood who that was.
Yeah.
The brilliant thing about Steve Jobs was that he literally gave himself a costume.
An icon, yeah.
He made himself into a cartoon,
Yeah.
in a way. I mean, in a good way.
Yeah.
I think cartoons are great. So he made himself into
Yeah.
a cartoon, into a design element.
Yeah.
So that gave me a lot of help in the project. But how you read into it, how you read his actions in the book. I didn't actually plan. Someone pointed out to me that he's very violent to other people.
Yeah.
And it's true, he is.
Yeah.
But frankly, I honestly was mostly choosing pages from comics that are melodramatic or highly comedic, and so that you're going to have these like really broad emotions displayed. I respect Steve Jobs. I wince at him. I think he seems like he was a complicated person. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But I did not come to bury Steve Jobs.
Right.
But I see it's in the book. But the other thing I tell people is it's not Steve Jobs. It's characters dressed as him, because I'm not representing his actions. You will, as a reader, infer that it's him, but it's, the guy wearing the Batman suit isn't necessarily Bruce Wayne. It could just as easily be, tell me the other guy who was Batman for a while in the Batman comics. I can't remember his name. Azrael? What? I don't remember.
I didn't follow that stuff.
Anyway, so, Captain America isn't necessarily Steve Rogers. It could be, again, like these characters, this happens a lot in comic books. Someone else wears the costume and then becomes the hero for a few issues before the original guy comes back. So, I mean, the thing is, the reason I'm hedging is not because I'm worried about Apple's lawyers, but also just because that wasn't the intent of the project.
Right.
What I love about this project is that you can read into it so many different ideas.
Right.
And I don't usually have the guts to do that, and I wanted to make a project that was where I just sort of let it happen.
Yeah.
It also gave me the opportunity to parody a lot of younger cartoonists who I've never had the chance to parody before. So people like Kate Beaton and Jillian Tamaki and Raina Telgemeier and many others, as a way of sort of like embracing like a wider range of cartoonists than I'd ever been able to sort of approach before in my work. So because it's a very abstract project, it let me sort of make comics in a different way, which was really kind of liberating for me. So as an exercise, and as an exercise, as an experiment, as a Mount Everest to climb, I found it very useful to make this thing. But I think my other work just hasn't hit people the same way. I am dying to put out my next volume of Masterpiece Comics. Yeah. And I'm actually working on my next one. So it's not... Well, this isn't like superseding it. It's something I did because I had the opportunity. And I mean, I'm grateful people responded to it. But honestly, it was really more of an exercise for me that grew into something bigger. So
yeah, I mean, the common denominator between the Trump and the Apple thing is that you're dealing with personalities or entities that are like very global in terms of people's consciousness. Whereas with the Masterpiece Comics, you're dealing with literature, which is not that universal, unfortunately, anymore. And it's easy for people to go, oh, that's an odd kind of subset of comics. But what you're doing now is you're sort of like tackling these, very like, kitchen household kind of.
Yeah.
When you were, I'm just curious, like the pleasure, of your absurdity and jamming stuff together is kind of like present. Like, does it ruin it to explain it and talk about it like we're doing now, or when you're in a panel on TCAF, or to justify it through the interview tour?
I don't think so.
Does it suck it out?
I have. It's very hard to have that perspective on your work.
Not for yourself, obviously.
No, not for me at all. I like talking about it, and and in some ways, I've heard authors say this, and I think it's true. Like sometimes by talking about it, you know what you made. Like sometimes you don't always know what you make before you start having to like think about it and try to explain to people what it is. I mean, I don't think my work is very deep, but I think you, as conscious as I try to be about what I do, I think there's a lot of unconsciousness in what happens when you make work. So I think I find it useful to talk about. One thing that I think is interesting, and I'm not sure what to do about it, is when I started making Masterpiece comics, the whole series, which began with like the Gregor Brown, the Metamorphosis and Peanut strip, and also
Maryworth.
Yeah, McWorth. Yeah. When I first was making those, I thought, well, here I am choosing a famous comic strip style that most people might know, even if they hadn't read a lot of it. People know what Peanuts is. Maybe not Maryworth, but people knew what Peanuts was. You know, I did a Bazooka Joe in retelling of Dante's Inferno. That was the other early one I did. Again, it was like Bazooka Joe is a very common strip in America, so people are familiar with it. And then I thought, as you read it, you'd recognize the literature behind it. But now I have literature teachers saying, oh, I gave your comic to my high school students because they're reading The Scarlet Letter or they're reading Crime and Punishment. And I think that's kind of bizarre. I feel like, it's a
substitute?
No, it's sort of a way in. Or maybe it's not necessarily a way in, but maybe it's another approach to it. But I would be concerned that people would be reading my stuff before they read the classics, because I would worry about thinking of Batman the entire time I was reading Crime and Punishment. And like that is surreal to me. Which isn't exactly what you're talking about, but you know, you do have to enter my work kind of like knowing a few things. Not that you have to have read the stuff. I'm hoping that it's engaging enough. I mean, I'm working with really good authors, so I think the books remain engaging if you see them in this form. But you know, how you put the pieces together is always
I know what you're saying, mysterious. Because this is kind of like it's kind of a paradox for you, because we're living in a time like that's defined by that Simpsons and other stuff kind of, you know, that humor, where it seems like a natural fit for your stuff. And I think to some degree the Steve Jobs and Trump do kind of fall into that. But also you're bringing like a depth and a knowledge that this current generation doesn't necessarily have or go to. Like I think it's a generation which really loves parody and a certain kind of skewed type of humor and a quirky kind of humor and whatever, all of that ironic kind of, it's a very ironic generation. But it's just the fun of that as opposed to like the deeper roots of that. Whereas what you're saying is it's better if like they read your stuff having an understanding of that deeper stuff. So I think that's what you're doing. That's different.
I guess so. I mean, I wouldn't want to put it in generational terms. I mean, I wouldn't expect most people to know half the comics that I parody. I in the Terms and Conditions book, I made a real effort to bring in people that I hadn't parodied before, and I'm sure a lot of people who read the book probably wouldn't be able to identify every page, because I wouldn't have. If I didn't make it, I wouldn't be able to do it. So I don't really expect everyone to have depth. I just wonder about, you know, I mean, I'm talking about very young. If you just haven't read, you know, if you haven't read these books before and you're very young, I wouldn't have expected you to. It's like, you know, it's just a different approach. But you know, my brother has still never. What was it? Which book was it? The Stranger? Someone was. A number of people have been like, well, I've never read The Stranger, but I still get that strip, so that's good. The Action Camus comic. You know, my interests are very skewed, and I know that. So, you know, what people respond to. I mean, you never know. Whenever you make a work, you never know who's going to respond to it. And I'm grateful for anybody who finds a way into what I do. Anyone that's engaged enough to read it, that's great. So,
when you were picking the newer artists, did you feel any kind of generational dissonance there, or just like Did you ever feel like I feel like, oh, sometimes I'm old. Like I come to TCAF and I go, there are all these names I just don't recognize, and I'm sure many of them are fantastic, but I just don't know how to. Did you feel any of that?
Well, the project was kind of
geared towards discovering them?
Either geared toward discovering them, or I felt like the reason to make the project was that I was now at a point where I could parody just as many younger artists as I could older artists who were, either very famous or brilliant. Often both. So the book kind of sprung out of the desire to sort of like connect to comics in a new way. Again, the length of it was part of that, as well as the people I was parodying. But I mean, I'm more familiar with Hergé. There's a Tintin page. I'm more familiar with Hergé than some younger cartoonists, but I don't think we had anything in common either. So, everyone's coming from their own perspective. I hear what you're saying, but I'm always reluctant to sort of talk about it in terms of
generational,
or just in terms of like not getting it. Because I mean, there's plenty of things I don't get, but the terms and conditions book was really, I was trying to sort of embrace all of it and suggest it's all equally good. So it's and for years I've been like, oh, I would love to parody so and so. I'm never going to get to do them because they're not, I wouldn't know how to parody. I wouldn't know how to make a postmodern strip using someone whose work is naturally postmodern. Like someone like Michael DeForge, for instance, like someone who embraces a lot of different styles and his work is very self-aware. It's easier to parody older stuff because we see it from a different viewpoint. But maybe that's not fair to that old work because we're like saying, oh, that's not as deep as what we're doing now. But we just see it differently. We have a different perspective on it. But it's much harder, I think, to do that with people who are still working now. Whose lives aren't written yet. They're still evolving. You can't kind of like go, I got you at that point.
Yeah. Well, Alan Moore's stuff would parody a lot. Like, I mean, like more than 50% of his career, I think, would be just like cataloging stuff in a very kind of postmodern, ironic way. And then his text would also make jokes at, some kind of like Daisy Duck character would say, I just wear, a big bow and no underpants, and that's how I get my man, kind of thing. That kind of thing. So there is a kind of a pleasure in understanding those kind of, less self-conscious styles than, But just to go back to you picking stuff, like people have been saying, well, it's kind of like a love letter to the history of comics, the iTunes thing. But it's not in order. It doesn't go chronologically through the history of comics. So how did you pick which, like, let's say you picked your artist, and I'm not going to ask how you picked your artist, but let's say, you got Neil Adams, and you got Winsor McKay, and you got Kate Beaton, and you got whatever. How do you decide which text goes with which? I sort of understand how you've designed the captions because that's natural to the artist. But how do you decide which text, and are there any connections at all? Because when you read them, you want to make connections. That comics reading thing is so ingrained that you want to... It's so natural for the text to not... for the picture to not be depicting what the text says. We're so used to making meaning out of that disjunction that it's frustrating in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that was part of the idea.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't think that much about how the text would go with the drawings.
Because sometimes I felt like there were there's
a lot of times when things sync up, and it's very satisfying.
Yeah.
And most of that is completely random. And again, that goes back to the Cage idea.
Yeah.
I love reading Cage's writings about his work, and I can't always get in the zone to appreciate his actual music and his actual performances.
Because it's so atonal.
It's very, you really have to be in the right mind for it. And I feel terrible saying that because I think he was after something that is really worthy of striving for, but I'm not I'm not evolved enough to get it.
Or it's so intellectual that if you need pleasure on any level, that it's go on.
But the thing about comics is that you do make those connections.
Yeah.
The Peanuts page, the character of Snoopy, who's dressed as Steve Jobs, is walking around the neighborhood all alone, and all the text is about family sharing. And you're talking about, like, you can make an account with your family, and you can, you can share your data with them, and you can all, join in the fun of iTunes. And the whole point is that, you feel the loneliness. It's actually poignant to have that text juxtaposed with the art, and that happens in a few places. There's a scene where a couple is embracing in the rain, and the woman pulls away as the man is saying, "Apple reserves the right to make changes to this agreement."
Right.
So that's one that really jumps out at you. And these are sprinkled through, as I say, mostly entirely randomly, because I broke down the text, I did the drawings. And then after I did a batch of like 10 drawings, 10 pages, I would combine them with the text from the beginning.
Yeah.
So I just sort of like kept thinking of what artists I might want to include. I would draw those pages and then I would put them together. Kind of, I would do like batches of 10 pages at a time. So how they came together was very random. I tried to like create visual disjunction from page to page. So very, very radically different from one to the next.
Right.
So most of it was done for the visual aesthetics and not so much for the syncing of the text. And again, this is something that was intentional because I find there are plenty of very literal-minded, earnest nonfiction comics that can be tedious to read in another direction, whereas I feel like that they often repeat information, visuals. Something that I've seen in books before, it's like someone is describing, there's a description of a chair. So the comics panel features someone talking to the reader with a big word balloon explaining what a chair is, and he's gesturing to a drawing of a chair. So it's redundancy over redundancy. Yeah. So again, I chose this text because I thought I don't even have to try to adapt this. If you read 4 pages of my book, you've read way more than you did of the original text when you agreed to it to get iTunes. So I think the book is an art object. I mean, people have told me they've read the whole thing, but I know other people have been.
I found it very difficult. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. No, I understand. Yeah. I understand. But that was part of the point. I was trying to make a different kind of comic, mostly for myself, but I think it was an experiment, and if someone else can build on this experiment and make something better, but that is equally disjointed, I'd like to see it.
I mean, for me, the one that I noticed was, I don't remember the artist that you're paying homage to, but it was sort of one of those artists that was like that Liechtenstein would copy, I think. Mm-hmm. And it started out with copyright at the top. And I thought, is he doing that to like make a commentary about Liechtenstein's appropriating? Were you or were you not?
I don't remember what page that was because there are a few kind of 50s style comics in there, and that's probably what you were thinking of.
Yeah.
I mean, I did start the book with a Rex Morgan page, which is the most banal square drawing of people in a room. They were originally talking to each other. Now they're just standing there as you are introduced to the conceit of the book. And I chose that page because I wanted something utterly dull and pedestrian, which is what this book could have turned into, but I tried hard to avoid it.
So it's not copyright, it's this one, intellectual property. And I thought he's definitely making a comment about Liechtenstein's appropriation of...
Oh, that's interesting. I can see why you said that. That's actually from, I believe it's Frontline Combat, and that's a Alex Toth page, written by Harvey Kurtzman.
I can see the Toth now.
Yeah. So it does look rather like one of his, but no, I didn't.
Got it.
But I really wanted to just let it happen.
Right.
You have to understand, like, the comics of mine that you have talked about, like the Gregor Brown or the Little Pearl. These things would take months to do.
Yeah.
And I was really trying to, like, see what it would be like to be someone who could
draw faster,
who could make a book in 2 years.
Yeah. No.
which I hear tell cartoonists can do, but
Yes.
I've never had that experience. So it was really kind of it was an experiment for me to see what would come of this.
I don't mean this as a criticism, but I did notice that compared to the Masterpiece comics, which, as you mentioned, you spent years doing, versus this, it wasn't as, the fidelity wasn't there. So I was wondering if, as you were getting older, it was harder to painstakingly recreate somebody else's, because I noticed that a lot of times you're using either a marker or the same size brush, like between pages, as opposed to finding the exact. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that was
expediency.
That was the process of making this book. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was actually drawn digitally.
Oh, okay.
And you can
Okay.
and I have made more of an effort to match styles even digitally. Like there's very little downside to working digitally if you want to, like, replicate a style. But no, the book was made as it's kind of an endurance test in a way. So yeah, if I got it to the level of Masterpiece Comics, it probably would have taken me 10 years to do.
Right.
So that wasn't what the book was about.
Got it.
Yeah. No, it's not the way I'll make my next book.
Well, before I ask you what your next book would be, you've said in interviews that it takes you a while to, like, learn the art of style so, like, if I was to do what you were doing, I just, like, plop the page I want in front of me, and I'll be like, I might change some things, but I'd just try to copy it as best I could. And somebody else might even trace it, especially digitally, you could do that. Mm-hmm. But, like, are you saying that you actually, like, learn to internalize the aesthetic values and to replicate it like a method actor would?
Well, I try to do that. I mean, for the Terms and Conditions and for the Trump book, I'm ripping off specific pages, specific styles, specific.
Right,
specific
for Masterpiece
But
Comics.
for Masterpiece Comics,
you weren't,
when you're making it, when you're retelling a whole story in a particular style, then you have to kind of figure out their approach to storytelling, their approach to panel breakdown, their sense of composition. So what I usually do when I make a longer story like that is I'll compile what would be called a swipe file, where I, like, will cut out specific panels that I might use as reference or specific poses I would use as reference. And then you kind of have to composite all those pieces together, keeping in mind the kind of storytelling devices they would use. It's very easily seen in something like the Little Pearl story. All of the Little Lulu comics were pages with 4 tiers, and generally that would mean between 8 and 12 panels on a page. So you have to take the story that you're working with, which in that case was the Scarlet Letter, and then boil it down to fit on over 12 pages, which was the average length of a Little Lulu story, using the 4 tiers, and hopefully getting the jokes coming at the right pace, and hopefully getting the storytelling to move along at the right pace. Yeah. So that's the process of sort of, like, figuring out, getting in the head of the writer or artist you're parodying, and then figuring out exactly how they would tell the story. So I guess it's a kind of method acting, if method acting was actually, drawing comics.
Yeah. So you said you're working on something new, or?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the middle of the sequel to Masterpiece Comics.
Oh yes, right.
And that was kind of when I had the freak out that I'm like, this is still years away.
Any chance that you would talk about any of the pairings coming up?
Oh, well, I could talk about some of the ones I've just done. It's really hard for me to talk about stuff I haven't done yet, because
fair enough.
But I am working on this Moby Dick adaptation, which I've been working on and off for 10 years. But that will definitely be in the book.
So can you say what comics you're pairing or filtering Moby Dick?
No, I can't.
You can't? Okay.
No, I'm very superstitious before I've actually put it out. It's really hard to do that. But the ones that I have done already, which you may have seen, were a version of...
The Iliad, I've seen that one.
Yes.
I just... Jumbles.
Yes. There's the comic, the Jumble, the Daily Jumble, retells the Iliad. So it's the Jumbiliad.
And I've seen the Tom Sawyer one, which is like Family Circus.
Right. And then I did...
Great.
Thanks. And then I also did a version of the Marquis de Sade's Justine in the style of 1940s Wonder Woman comics, which was in Best American Comics a year or two ago. So, and I have about 20 pages. I still have to do another 25, 30 pages. So it's a ways away, but I'm getting there. So that's cool. But that's going back to my usual process of like really boiling the story down and figuring out the style.
Are you still contributing to the New Yorker, or?
I haven't done anything for them in a while.
Did you come in under Francoise's art directorship?
Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah. I came in when Francoise was the art director.
Right.
And she's great to work with. And she, I actually was pitching. I was originally pitching interior illustrations, and one of those got chosen to be a cover, which was incredible. Beginner's luck, because after that I worked really hard, and I got a few covers while Tina Brown was there. She was the editor-in-chief. She seemed to like my work a lot. So it would go through Francoise, but ultimately has to be approved by Tina. Yeah. Now David Remnick is there, and I kind of fell off with submitting covers. I've had a few illustrations inside, but not much in the last couple of years. But Francoise has been great to work with, and she helped. She actually posted a big series of pages from Terms and Conditions when I was working on that, which was great.
Okay, that's great. I mean, unless there's anything else you'd want to say. I did sort of want to ask you about your teaching duties, but I think you probably want some rest before your next...
I have a couple minutes. If you had a question, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah,
we're fine for time.
Okay, great. Yeah, let me ask you, just because I'm a teacher too, so I'm always fascinated when I meet other teachers. Just anything you want to say about that? I mean, what peculiarities do you find with students of the current generation or the current crop? Like anything you can kind of speak to in terms of their mindset or their values, or what you see them doing once they go out into the art world?
Wow. I teach at Parsons. I teach in the illustration department. And I've taught comics there, which is great because you get some students who really are invested in comics and even their own characters, and other students who are coming to it fresh. So it's always fascinating to sort of see people making comics for the first time and figuring it out and coming up with different ways of approaching the whole form, which I find really exciting. But right now I teach a class called Senior Thesis, which is for the illustration department, and in that class the students get to choose a project that they work on over the course of a whole semester. And it's very open. So some of them are making paintings, some of them are making comics, animation, book illustration, designing tattoos, all sorts of things. I really like that class because it's very open, and I really encourage them to experiment. And it's kind of an unusual class because it's driven less by specific assignments and more by their own interests. I would say the one thing that I really try to emphasize with them for that class is to schedule their time, because that's always an issue for artists, I would say. And they're young, so they haven't necessarily spent a concentrated amount of time working on a big project, where the deadlines could be kind of fluid because they're not there aren't other people in the class who they can compare themselves to sometimes if they're doing something very different. It's kind of hard to sort of keep on track when not everyone is like turning in the work at the same time.
Right.
It's due at the end, but how you get to that end point is very different. So I like that class because even if they're bringing me work that I maybe can't speak to, like on a technical level, like I might not know Maya or some 3D program if they're doing like some game design, but I can talk to them about aesthetics, and I can talk to them about scheduling, and I can talk to them about other things. So it's a great class for me because I like being able to jump around and talk to people in different ways.
Right.
As far as like generational things, I'm not the best person to ask about that. I'm kind of reluctant to kind of talk about students today versus students from the past.
Fair enough.
Because human nature is human nature. I think that there's different issues now. I think a couple of things that are interesting that are happening is that a lot of students will come to class and say, I have a story I want to tell, but there's a backstory and it's 600 pages long. And I think this is happening, I think, in all media, is that we are living in an era, unlike those old 4-panel comics that I was talking about that I grew up reading. We're living in an era where people expect stories to be infinite and I guess be carried on by a corporation after you sell the rights. Like Star Wars, or I guess Harry Potter might end up that way. Where these worlds are built and become franchises. I don't know if students are thinking of it in terms of franchises, but I think they're definitely thinking of it in terms of the way that TV is written now and the way movies are made now, where everything interlinks and there's always a backstory. I'm a big believer in the story.
Having
the story
its own
starts.
integrity.
What's that?
Having its own like natural kind of organic integrity.
Either that, or the story starts when the characters are interesting.
Yeah.
As opposed to, well, what were they doing when they were children? Well, they weren't interesting yet.
Right.
I guess that's a reflection of them, but I think it's really a reflection of the culture. It's just that the culture is really is all about the universe. The Marvel universe, or the Godzilla universe, or the Potter universe,
sure.
So everything kind of has this own like world building thing, which is cool. But I always tell my students, just like take your characters and just have them do a conversation, and it could be like part of your big story, but just like do 10 pages of that and see how it goes, and then you can build out from there. But like show us the characters being interesting, and don't worry about. Because I feel like sometimes it's overwhelming. Like I don't think students need to worry about the generational saga yet.
It's a little ambitious, maybe. Yeah.
I mean, I love ambition. Ambition is great, and I love that some of them have been thinking about this. I mean, they're 20 years old, but some of them have been like, oh, I've been doing this since sixth grade. I had these characters in mind, and like they're locked in. And like that's kind of great, but like you got to get started. So that's that. I think that's one thing that I see coming up. Not with everyone, but often.
Do they read your stuff and kind of see you as the author of all this parody stuff and see you that way, or are you Professor Sikoryak and that's like in a different world and their relationship is primarily? So what did you think of my latest project? And
I'm not sure. I don't make them read my work. Some of them have said, "Oh, I've seen your stuff," but I don't push it on them.
Familiar kind of.
What's that?
Do you have a very familiar kind of relationship with them, or is it more like teacher-student?
Well, I mean, they're so much younger than me. I feel like it's naturally there's probably some distance there. But I mean, they call me Bob.
Yeah.
I mean, I try to be available and helpful in any way, but I'm also I don't know how you were in school, but unless I was really connecting to a teacher, I didn't have a good sense of their work outside of class.
Well, I mostly didn't, except when I took creative writing in undergrad, and it was just common for I think students to check out their teacher stuff because you want to you wanted them to help you get better. So
Sure.
yeah.
No, but I mean, it varied. It varied from
Yeah,
teacher to
yeah,
teacher.
yeah.
I mean, I had one of my teachers from Parsons when I went was Stephen Gornaccia, who at the time introduced me to Art and Francoise at Raw, and we're still good friends. And he hired me back to teach at the school when he became chair. So I totally see the value of making connection to teachers, and I encourage my students to keep in touch. But I don't, they have their own lives. I don't want to, it's like I don't have kids, but I'm assuming like at a certain point you're like, well, you have to live your own life. And,
On the whole, it doesn't sound that different from like being a student or a teacher, like in the 80s. I mean, I'm sure like maybe it was airbrushing was the new thing or whatever,
Right.
but it sounds pretty similar to me.
Well, the one great thing that's happening now is just there's so much access to the history
Of comics.
of art, of illustration. If students are inclined, they have avenues to find lots of inspiration from lots of different eras.
Right.
Not everyone wants to do that. If you want to have a contemporary style, then you might not be looking back. But for those people who want to learn more, there's certainly lots of resources online. And I'm not trying to give up my own input to them, but just to say that I think it's great that there's more than they could possibly look at.
Yeah.
Koom took a photo of our Sikoryak that's in the show notes. Write us at mail@deconstructingcomics.com or look us up on Patreon, Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review in Apple Podcasts or Stitcher. Our theme is from bensound.com. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and Mulele and I will critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. The most recent episode is right behind this one in the podcast feed. This coming Thursday on To the Bat Poles, Adam West kisses his movie Catwoman, Lee Merriweather, again, in King Tut's Coup and Batman's Waterloo. Look up To the Bat Poles wherever you find your podcasts or at tothebatpoles.libsyn.com. As you may find in going through our older episodes, we used to review comics-related movies on this show. We haven't done it much in recent years, but next week Kumar and Dana revive this old tradition by reviewing the latest Wolverine movie, Logan. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.